kick her again. Let's see if this stray actually has a healing factor. Vance's voice echoed off the damp brick of the alleyway, thick with cruel amusement. Alora curled tighter into a ball, tasting copper, her ribs screaming as another heavy boot connected with her side. "She's just an Omega, Vance. You're going to kill her," a younger voice muttered, laced with hesitant panic. "Good. Less trash for the pack to feed." Vance grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back so she was forced to look up into his sneering face. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, mutt." Alora spat a mouthful of blood onto his expensive leather boots. She didn't say a single word. She didn't have to. The shadows behind Vance were already beginning to move. The rain had started an hour ago, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the asphalt of the alley behind the Silvercrest Pack's main estate. To the humans passing by on the main street a block away, it was just another gloomy Tuesday night in the city. To Alora, it was the night her endurance finally ran out. She lay on her side against a pile of discarded wooden pallets, the rough wood scraping against her bruised cheek. Every breath she drew felt like swallowing broken glass. Her body, severely malnourished and pushed to the brink by years of forced servitude, was failing to heal the trauma Vance and his enforcers were inflicting upon her. "Wipe it off," Vance ordered, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. He stared down at the dark smear of Alora's blood on his boot. He was a beta of the Silvercrest Pack, a man whose ego was vastly disproportionate to his actual strength. He wore a tailored suit jacket over a dark t-shirt, completely unbothered by the rain, radiating the suffocating, spicy scent of cheap dominance. Alora kept her eyes fixed on the wet pavement. Her silence was her only remaining weapon. Years ago, before her father's disgrace, before she was stripped of her rank and shoved to the absolute bottom of the pack hierarchy, she might have fought back. She might have shifted and torn Vance's throat out. But the silver-laced collar hidden beneath the collar of her frayed jacket prevented any shift, suppressing her wolf until it was nothing but a distant, agonizing whimper in her mind. "I said wipe it off," Vance roared, his composure cracking. He drove his heel into her shoulder, pinning her to the ground. A sharp gasp escaped Alora's lips, but she forced her jaw shut immediately after. She would not give him the satisfaction of a scream. Beside Vance stood two younger enforcers, Marcus and Toby. Marcus looked bored, chewing on a toothpick, while Toby shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting nervously toward the mouth of the alley. "Vance, man, come on. The Alpha wants her scrubbing the kitchens by morning," Toby said, his voice tight. "If you break her legs, who's going to do the grunt work?" "She has hands, doesn't she? She can crawl." Vance knelt down, his fingers gripping Alora's jaw with bruising force. "You think you're so brave, keeping quiet. You think your silence makes you strong. But you're nothing, Alora. You're a ghost, occupying space in my territory." Alora forced her eyes up to meet his. Her vision was swimming, the edges of the world blurring with dark, creeping spots. But through the haze of pain, her heightened senses picked up something else. The air in the alley was changing. The sharp scent of wet garbage and Vance's obnoxious cologne was suddenly being swallowed by something infinitely heavier. It smelled of ozone, of deep, ancient pine forests, of impending violence. Vance didn't notice. His senses were dulled by his own arrogance, too focused on the thrill of dominating a defenseless Omega. But Alora felt it. A low, vibrating hum resonated through the wet concrete, a frequency so deep it bypassed the ears and rattled directly against the bones. "Are you even listening to me?" Vance spat, raising his hand to strike her again. Alora smiled. It was a small, broken, bloody thing. But it was a smile. It infuriated him. "What is so funny?" Vance demanded, his hand halting in midair. "You..." Alora wheezed, her voice a rough, gravelly rasp. "You talk. Too much." She could see them now. Not clearly, just the faint distortion of light at the far end of the alley, where the street lamp flickered and died. The shadows were detaching themselves from the brick walls. They were bleeding out from the dumpsters, melting down from the fire escapes. Silent. Absolute. "Crazy bitch," Marcus muttered, spitting his toothpick onto the ground. "She's finally lost her mind." "Let's fix that," Vance sneered, stepping back and raising his boot for a final, devastating kick to her ribs. Alora closed her eyes. She let her mind drift away from the pain, reaching out toward that scent of ozone and pine. She remembered a whispered promise in the dark. Months ago, across a territorial border she was never supposed to cross. "Endure. Just a little longer. When the treaty ends, I am coming for you." The heavy thud of Vance's boot never came. A sickening crack echoed through the alley, followed instantly by a guttural scream. Alora's eyes snapped open. Vance was no longer standing over her. He was on his knees 10 feet away, clutching his right leg. His shin bone was bent at a grotesque, impossible angle. Marcus and Toby froze, their bravado instantly evaporating into pure, unfiltered terror. Neither of them had seen what hit Vance. There had been no warning growl, no heavy footfalls, just a blur of impossible darkness, and then Vance was on the ground, shrieking in agony. The temperature in the alley plummeted. The light drizzle suddenly felt like ice against Alora's skin. "What the hell was that?" Marcus yelled, his hands trembling as his claws instinctively elongated. He spun in a frantic circle, trying to track a threat he couldn't see. "Vance! Vance, get up!" Toby cried, backing away toward the brick wall. "My leg! My fucking leg!" Vance sobbed, his alpha posturing completely shattered. He looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning horror. The shadows at the end of the alley stepped forward into the dim, ambient light of the city. They were massive, wolves the size of draft horses, their fur pitch black, absorbing the meager light around them. Their eyes burned with a terrifying uniform gold. They didn't growl. They didn't snarl. Their silence was infinitely more predatory than any noise they could have made. One by one, they filed into the alley. 5, 10, 20. They poured over the chain-link fences, dropped silently from the low rooftops, and materialized from the deep gloom of the street. 50 wolves of the Obsidian Pack, the most feared syndicate of shifters on the continent, had just breached Silvercrest territory without triggering a single alarm. And they were forming a perfect, impenetrable perimeter around Alora. Marcus whimpered, his back hitting the wet brick wall. He was trapped. There were at least a dozen massive wolves blocking the exit to the street, their golden eyes fixed on him with cold calculation. From the center of the pack, the largest wolf, a beast of terrifying proportions with fur like spun midnight, stepped forward. The air warped around it as flesh and bone seamlessly reconfigured. Within a second, where the monstrous wolf had stood, a man now stood. Kalen. He was dressed in dark, tactical clothing, his posture relaxed, but radiating a lethal, overwhelming aura that forced Marcus and Toby to drop to their knees involuntarily. The sheer pressure of his alpha command was suffocating, pressing down on the alley like a physical weight. Kalen ignored the two enforcers. He ignored Vance, who was crawling backward through the puddles, leaving a trail of blood from his shattered leg. Kalen's golden eyes, burning with a barely restrained inferno of rage, locked onto Alora. Seeing her battered body, the blood matting her hair, and the cruel silver collar biting into her neck, a muscle feathered in Kalen's jaw. The silence in the alley grew so intense, it felt like a vacuum, waiting for a spark to ignite an explosion. He walked toward her, his footsteps making no sound on the wet pavement. Vance, delirious with pain and panic, tried to speak. "You're breaking the treaty. The Obsidian Pack. You can't be here. Kalen didn't even look at him. As he passed, Kalen casually flicked his wrist. The massive wolf to his left lunged, its jaws clamping silently over Vance's shoulder, pinning the beta to the asphalt with bone-crushing force, cutting off his words with a choked gasp of agony. Kalen knelt in the filth of the alley beside Alora. Up close, she could see the frantic, terrified worry breaking through his icy exterior. He reached out, his large, warm hands hovering over her bruised ribs, afraid to touch her and cause her more pain. "Kalen," Alora whispered, the edges of her vision finally turning black as the adrenaline left her system. The pain was too much. Her body was shutting down. "I'm here, little wolf," Kalen murmured, his voice a deep, rough velvet that chased away the cold. "I told you I'd come." He gently slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her broken body against his chest. Alora let her head fall against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and ozone. For the first time in 5 years, she felt safe. As darkness claimed her, the last thing Alora heard was Kalen's voice, turning from soft velvet into a weapon of mass destruction as he finally addressed the Silvercrest wolves. "Kill them. Leave enough of the beta to deliver a message." The journey out of Silvercrest territory was a masterclass in silent, lethal precision. There were no triumphant howls, no chaotic scrambling. The Obsidian Pack moved like water slipping through cracked pavement. Alora drifted in and out of consciousness, anchored to reality only by the steady, thumping rhythm of Kalen's heartbeat beneath her ear. She was vaguely aware of being carried out of the rain and into the cavernous, heated back of a heavily armored SUV. The smell of rich leather and Kalen's overwhelming scent of pine and ozone cocooned her, chasing away the metallic tang of her own blood. "Sit rep," Kalen commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Alora's aching chest as he settled her across his lap, utterly ignoring the blood staining his tactical gear. From the driver's seat, Silas, Kalen's beta, spoke in a clipped, professional tone. "Target's neutralized. Vance is alive, though he won't be walking unassisted anytime soon. The perimeter is secure. We are 3 minutes from the border." "Did they trigger the alarms?" "Not until we were already back over the fence," Silas replied, the faint reflection of streetlights catching the grim satisfaction in his eyes via the rearview mirror. "Alpha Rylan is going to lose his mind when he realizes we bypassed his $1 million security grid without tripping a single wire." "Let him," Kalen said coldly. He shifted slightly, his large hand moving to gently cup the side of Alora's face, shielding her cheek from the rough fabric of his vest. His thumb brushed featherlight over the swelling near her eye. "Speed up, Silas. I want her in the medical wing 10 minutes ago." The SUV surged forward, the engine letting out a deep, guttural roar that matched the protective fury radiating from the Alpha in the back seat. Alora forced her heavy eyelids open. The world was a blur of passing streetlights and dark, tinted windows. "Kalen," she rasped, her throat agonizingly dry. "Shh. Don't speak. Save your strength." His golden eyes, usually so intimidating to others, were entirely focused on her, soft and fraught with a guilt he couldn't hide. "The treaty," she managed to whisper, her mind sluggishly recalling the political suicide of what had just happened. For 5 years, a fragile, ironclad treaty had kept the major packs from outright war. Silvercrest controlled the city's ports, Obsidian controlled the northern territories, and the wealth that flowed from them. "The treaty expired at exactly midnight," Kalen murmured, his jaw hardening as he looked out the window toward the receding city skyline. "Rylan thought I would negotiate an extension. He thought he had leverage." He looked back down at her, his expression softening only for her. "I was watching the clock, Alora. The second the hand struck 12, my wolves were already over his walls. She wanted to ask how he had known where to find her, how he had known she was at her breaking point, but the agonizing throb in her ribs stole her breath. Years ago, before her father, Alpha Thorn, had been framed for embezzlement and treason by Rylan, Alora had known Kaelin. They had been teenagers, heirs to neighboring, tentatively allied packs. They had shared stolen moments by the border river, whispered dreams of a united front. Then her father was executed. Her rank was violently stripped, and she was thrust into the brutal life of a collared Omega servant. Kaelin, newly ascended to Alpha of a destabilized pack, had been forced to sign the treaty to protect his own people, legally binding him from interfering with Silvercrest's internal affairs. He had waited 5 long years. "Rest, little wolf," Kaelin whispered, pulling a thick, heated blanket from the compartment beside him and draping it over her shivering form. "You're never going back to that hell. I swear it on my life." As the heavy tires of the SUV crossed the graded bridge that marked the official border into Obsidian territory, Alora finally let go of the thread of consciousness, slipping into the dark. Alora awoke to the blinding sting of sterile white light and the rhythmic electronic beep of a heart monitor. For a terrifying, disorienting second, she thought she was in the Silvercrest basement, waiting for the pack doctor to casually reset a bone without anesthesia so she could get back to scrubbing floors. Panic flared, hot and sharp. She lunged upward, a ragged gasp tearing from her throat. "Whoa, easy, easy, you're safe." Gentle but firm hands pressed against her shoulders, easing her back against a bank of incredibly soft pillows. Alora blinked rapidly, her vision clearing to reveal a woman with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a white coat over a dark sweater. "I am Dr. Arias," the woman said, her voice a soothing, maternal hum. "You are in the Obsidian Pack citadel. You are safe, Alora." Alora's breathing slowed as her senses verified the doctor's words. The room smelled of clean linens, antiseptic, and, faintly, the lingering scent of Kaelin's pine. There was no mildew, no fear. "Where is he?" Alora rasped. Her voice sounded slightly better, less like grinding stones. "Right here." Kaelin stepped out of the shadows near the door. He had changed out of his tactical gear into a simple black Henley and dark jeans, but he looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his golden eyes, and his posture was uncharacteristically rigid. "How long was I out?" Alora asked, pulling the thick white comforter up to her chin, suddenly hyper-aware of her vulnerability. 2 days, Kaelin said, walking over to the foot of her bed. "Your body was shutting down. Aris had to put you in a medically induced coma to let your accelerated healing catch up without the stress of being conscious." Alora looked down at her arms. The deep purple bruises were already fading to a sickly yellow, and the cuts were scabbed over. Werewolf healing was a miracle, but it required energy she hadn't possessed in years. "She's stabilized," Dr. Aris said, picking up a medical chart. "Her ribs are knitting perfectly, and her internal bleeding has stopped. However," the doctor's expression turned grim as she looked at Kaelin, then back to Alora. "We need to address the collar." Alora's hand flew to her throat instinctively. Her fingers brushed the cold, unyielding metal hidden beneath the bandage wrapped around her neck. The silver-laced collar had been permanently locked onto her when she was 18. It suppressed her wolf, keeping her in a perpetual state of human weakness, and burned if she tried to draw on her shifter strength. "Take it off," Kaelin commanded, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "It's not that simple, Alpha," Aris sighed. "The lock is biometric, tied to Alpha Rylan. But more concerningly, the silver has caused heavy metal poisoning over the years. It is partially fused with the scar tissue around her carotid artery. Removing it will be agonizing, and her wolf, which has been starved and suppressed for 5 years, might shock her system when it suddenly breaks free. Alora stared at the wall, her heart pounding. The collar was her reality. It was the physical manifestation of her shame, her weakness, her stolen life. The thought of it being gone was terrifying in its own right. What if her wolf was dead? What if she truly was just broken? "Do it," Alora whispered. Kalen stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Alora, we can wait until you're stronger." "No." She looked up, meeting his golden gaze with a fierce, trembling defiance. "I won't spend another minute as his property. Get it off me." Kalen stared at her for a long moment, seeing the unbroken steel beneath her battered exterior. He nodded slowly to the doctor. "Very well," Oris said, pulling on a pair of surgical gloves and reaching for a specialized, heavy-duty rotary saw designed for shifter metals. "Kalen, you need to hold her. She cannot move, or I might sever an artery." Kalen moved to the head of the bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress, gathering Alora into his arms. He pressed her back against his broad chest, his arms wrapping securely around her shoulders and torso, locking her in a gentle, unbreakable cage of muscle. "I've got you," he whispered, burying his face in her hair. "I won't let you go." As the high-pitched whine of the saw began, Alora closed her eyes. The blade bit into the collar. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the room. The heat against her skin was immediate and excruciating, a searing line of fire digging into her throat. She screamed, her body arching involuntarily. Kalen held her tighter, absorbing her thrashing, whispering reassurances that were drowned out by the noise and her own agony. Snap. The sound was shockingly loud. The pressure around her windpipe vanished instantly. A heavy metallic clatter rang out as Oris dropped the two halves of the bloody silver collar into a surgical tray. Alora slumped back against Kalen, gasping for air. But as she drew in her first unhindered breath, something inside her, something that had been buried deep in the dark, chained and starving, opened its eyes. A profound, terrifying rush of power slammed into her consciousness. Her senses expanded explosively. She could hear the hum of the electricity in the walls, smell the fierce sweat on Dr. Eris's brow, feel the microscopic vibrations of the building. And she could feel Kalen. Not just his physical warmth, but the massive, overwhelming presence of his alpha aura, no longer muffled by the silver. It was a suffocating, intoxicating weight. Her wolf whimpered, then threw its head back and howled in her mind. 3 days after the collar was removed, Alora was relocated from the medical wing to a guest suite in Kalen's private residential wing. The room was larger than the entire basement she had lived in at Silvercrest, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a dense, sprawling pine forest. She stood by the glass, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and leggings that Kalen had provided. She was staring at her reflection. The physical scars were fading, but the emotional ones felt heavier now that she had time to process them. Without the collar, her wolf was constantly restless, pacing in the back of her mind, angry and disoriented. The heavy oak door clicked open. Kalen stepped inside, carrying a tray with a steaming mug of tea and a plate of food. He paused, his eyes catching hers in the reflection of the window. "You should be resting," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "If I lie in that bed any longer, my mind is going to eat itself," Alora replied quietly, turning to face him. She crossed her arms defensively. "How long are you going to keep me locked in this tower, Kalen?" He frowned, taking a step toward her. "You aren't locked in. There are guards outside your door for your protection, not your imprisonment. Rylan is hunting for you." Alora let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Hunting for an Omega? He has 100 Omegas to scrub his floors. Why risk a war with the Obsidian Pack over one broken stray?" Kalen's expression darkened. The easy, protective warmth he usually showed her evaporated, replaced by the calculating, dangerous gaze of a ruling alpha. He walked over to the table, leaning his hands flat against the wood. "Sit down, Alora." The command wasn't laced with alpha compulsion, but the gravity in his voice made her comply. She sat cautiously in one of the plush armchairs. "You've been lied to for 5 years, Kalen began, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. Silvercrest didn't just strip you of your rank because of your father's supposed crimes. They collared you because Rylan was terrified of what you were becoming." Alora frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I was just an alpha's daughter. I hadn't even presented yet when my father was killed." "Exactly," Kalen said, walking closer and kneeling in front of her chair, bringing himself to eye level so she wouldn't feel towered over. "Most wolves present their rank at 18, but your father knew your bloodline. He knew you carried the dormant gene of a true alpha." Alora froze. The air in her lungs suddenly felt entirely too thin. A true alpha is a myth, a bedtime story about wolves who can command without a pack. "It's not a myth," Kalen said softly. "Your father confided in me weeks before he died. He knew Rylan was corrupt, selling pack lands to human corporations, trafficking rogue shifters. Your father was gathering evidence to depose him. But Rylan found out. He framed your father, had him executed, and then he looked at you, the 16-year-old girl who would one day have the raw, genetic power to challenge him for the entire pack." Alora shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrests. No, I'm an Omega. I'm submissive. You are what a silver collar and 5 years of psychological torture forced you to be," Kalen interrupted, his voice fierce but profoundly sad. He reached out, gently wrapping his large hands over her trembling ones. "Rylan couldn't kill you. Your father had loyalists. Assassinating his young daughter would have sparked a civil war. So, Rylan collared you before you could present. He forced the pack to watch you be degraded, cementing the illusion that you were nothing but a weak Omega." Alora stared at Kalen's hands covering hers. The truth resonated deep within her chest, clicking into place like a key in a rusted lock. It explained why her wolf, now unchained, felt so impossibly large, so furious, so dominant despite her trauma. Before she could fully process the earth-shattering revelation, the door to the suite was thrown open. Silas stood in the doorway, his face pale, a tablet clutched tightly in his hand. He looked past Alora, locking eyes with his alpha. "Kalen," Silas said, his voice stripped of its usual calm protocol. "Rylan just broadcasted a message to the High Council." Kalen stood up slowly, the air around him crackling with sudden violent tension. "And?" "He has officially declared the Obsidian Pack in violation of continental law for the theft of Silvercrest property," Silas said grimly. "He's calling in his alliances. If we don't return Alora to the Silvercrest border by midnight tomorrow..." Silas swallowed hard. "They are going to march on our territory. It's war." The word war hung in the quiet of the guest suite, heavy and suffocating. Kalen didn't flinch. The golden rings in his irises flared, his jaw setting into a line of absolute granite. He didn't look at Alora. His focus was entirely on his beta. "How many men has he mobilized?" 300 enforcers at the southern border bridge, Alpha, Silas reported, his thumb swiping across the tablet. "And he's rallied the Crimson Creek and Ironjaw packs to his banner under the guise of treaty enforcement. They'll add another 400 to his ranks by tomorrow evening. If we fight them in an open field, we will be outnumbered 2-1. "Then we don't fight them in an open field," Kalen replied, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "Mobilize the vanguard. Line the tree line with our snipers. If a single Silvercrest paw touches Obsidian soil, turn the river red." "No." The word was quiet, brittle, and raspy, but it stopped Kalen dead. He turned slowly to look at Alora. She was still sitting in the armchair, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. She was visibly trembling, fighting a 5-year ingrained instinct to drop her eyes and bare her neck in submission to 2 dominant males discussing pack business. But she kept her chin up. She forced herself to look directly into Kaylin's burning gold eyes. "You will not start a war for me," Alora said, her voice shaking but gaining a fraction of volume. "You have women, children, elders in this pack. I will not have thousands of wolves slaughtered because I couldn't endure one more beating." "Alora," Kaylin stepped toward her, the lethal alpha instantly melting back into the man who had pulled her from the rain. "This isn't just about you. Rylan has been looking for an excuse to seize our northern mines for years. If I hand you back, I show weakness. He will march anyway." "He holds the High Council's favor," Silas interjected softly, recognizing the painful truth in Alora's words. "If we protect you, we are legally rogue. We stand alone." Alora stood up. Her legs were shaky, her newly healed ribs aching with the sudden movement. But the restless, furious energy of her unchained wolf pushed her forward. "If I go back, if I surrender myself, I will kill you myself before I let that happen," Kaylin snarled, the sound ripping from his chest with a terrifying, possessive ferocity. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands coming up to grip her upper arms, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to anchor her. "Listen to me. You are a true alpha. You are the rightful heir to the Silvercrest Pack. Rylan is a usurper. The Council's laws mean nothing in the face of ancient bloodlines." "I am a girl who has scrubbed toilets for 5 years," Alora cried out, a tear finally breaking free and tracking down her bruised cheek. "I don't know how to fight. I don't even know how to shift anymore. My wolf is a stranger to me. If you put me in front of Rylan, he won't see a true alpha. He'll see the broken omega he created." Silence fell over the room, thick with the tragic truth of her trauma. Kaylin's grip softened. He slid his hands down her arms, taking her trembling hands in his. He lifted them, pressing his lips to her bruised knuckles. "Then we have 24 hours to remind you exactly who you are," he murmured against her skin. The obsidian pine forest was freezing at midnight. The moon was a sliver of silver in the pitch-black sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Alora stood in a small clearing, shivering in nothing but a thin hospital gown. 2 miles away, the pack was preparing for a bloodbath. Here, in the dead of the woods, there was only the wind, the trees, and Kaylin. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his arms crossed over his chest. He was giving her space, but his presence was a heavy, grounding anchor. "The silver is gone, Alora," Kaylin's voice drifted across the clearing, calm and steady. "The only thing chaining her down now is your fear. You have to let her out. If you don't shift before the battle tomorrow, the adrenaline and proximity to violence will force a traumatic shift. It could tear your mind apart." Alora squeezed her eyes shut. She reached inward, feeling for the entity she had suppressed for so long. For years, her wolf had been a whimpering, starved thing hiding in the darkest corner of her mind. But now, it was pacing. It was massive, angry, and clawing at the doors of her consciousness. "Let me out," it seemed to snarl. "Let me kill them." "I'm afraid," Alora whispered, the admission tasting like ash. "What if I can't control it? What if she's just a monster after everything they did to us?" "You are not a monster," Kaylin said, taking a single step into the moonlight. "You are Alora of the Silvercrest bloodline. Let her breathe." Alora took a deep, shuddering breath of the freezing air. She let go of the mental wall she had built. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. She screamed as her bones began to fracture and lengthen. 5 years of forced stagnation meant her body was actively resisting the change. She fell to her knees in the snow, her spine arching as a sickening chorus of pops and cracks echoed in the silent woods. It felt like fire was pouring through her veins. "Push through it," Kalen barked, his alpha command lacing his voice, giving her the strength she lacked. "Do not fight it, Alora. Submit to the wolf." She threw her head back, a guttural cry tearing from her throat that seamlessly warped into a booming, earth-shaking howl. The hospital gown shredded as thick, pure white fur erupted from her skin. Her jaw extended, teeth lengthening into deadly, razor-sharp points. Within seconds, the agonizing cracking ceased, replaced by the heavy, huffing breaths of a massive predator. Alora opened her eyes. The world was entirely different. The dark woods were painted in sharp, vibrant grays and blues. She could hear the scurry of a mouse a mile away. She could smell the ozone in Kalen's blood. She stood. She was enormous, easily the size of a draft horse, her coat a brilliant, blinding white that seemed to gather the meager moonlight and reflect it back. Kalen let out a soft breath of awe. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his shirt and triggered his own shift. A heartbeat later, an impossibly large, midnight black wolf stood before her, his golden eyes burning with reverence. For a long moment, the black wolf and the white wolf simply stared at each other. Then, Kalen lowered his massive head, exposing the vulnerable line of his neck. It was a gesture of absolute, undeniable submission. An alpha bowing to a true alpha. Alora's wolf didn't attack. She stepped forward, pressing her cold nose against his neck, inhaling his scent of pine and safety. In the quiet of the Obsidian woods, the broken Omega died, and the true alpha was reborn. The grated metal bridge spanning the river border was slick with freezing rain. At the far end, Silvercrest territory was lit up by the headlights of dozens of tactical vehicles. 300 wolves stood in human and shifted forms, a sea of bared teeth and bloodlust. At the front of the army stood Alpha Rylan. He wore a tailored coat, holding a heavy silver-tipped cane, looking every bit the polished, untouchable politician. Beside him, leaning heavily on crutches, was Vance, his face twisted in a vindictive sneer. The digital clock on Ryland's dashboard ticked to 11:59 p.m. "He's not coming," Vance spat, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Kalen is arrogant, but he's not stupid enough to face this. He's probably halfway to the mountains by now." "Kalen's pride is his weakness," Ryland said smoothly, checking his gold pocket watch. "He won't run, but he will yield. The High Council has guaranteed my right to reclaim my property." As the clock struck midnight, the heavy fog on the Obsidian side of the bridge began to swirl. Rylan raised a hand, signaling his front line to prepare. Out of the mist, a single figure emerged, walking slowly down the center of the metal bridge. Rylan frowned, straining to see through the rain. It wasn't the massive, imposing figure of Alpha Kalen. It was a woman. She wore dark tactical pants, combat boots, and a fitted black leather jacket. Her hair, previously a matted, bloody mess, was braided tightly against her scalp. She walked with a terrifying, fluid grace, her footsteps echoing sharply against the grating. As she stepped under the harsh glare of the Silvercrest headlights, a collective gasp rippled through the front lines of Ryland's army. Vance nearly dropped his crutches, his face draining of all color. No, that's impossible. She can't!" Alora stopped 20 feet from Rylan. The collar was gone, replaced by an angry red scar that wrapped around her throat. But it wasn't the missing collar that caused Rylan's breath to hitch. It was her eyes. They were no longer the dull, submissive brown of a broken Omega. They were glowing with a radiant, piercing, ethereal silver, the undeniable genetic marker of a true alpha. "Where is Kalen?" Rylan demanded, struggling to maintain his composure. though his scent spiked with sudden, bitter panic. I am not negotiating with an Omega whore. Produce the girl and surrender, or my army marches. Alora didn't flinch at the insult. She didn't drop her gaze. She simply tilted her head, looking at the army of 300 wolves behind him. You aren't marching anywhere, Rylan, Alora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an unnatural, vibrating resonance that bypassed the ears and sank directly into the marrow of every wolf on the bridge. It was a frequency of pure, undeniable dominance. She took a single step forward, and the sheer, crushing weight of her newly unleashed aura slammed into the Silvercrest front line like a physical wall. I'm Alora, daughter of Alpha Thorn, she declared, her silver eyes blazing as the air around her literally began to warp with power. And I have come to take my pack back. The silence that followed Alora's declaration was absolute, broken only by the relentless patter of freezing rain against the metal bridge. For a fraction of a second, Alpha Rylan looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Then, his shock curdled into venomous, desperate fury. He raised his silver-tipped cane, pointing it directly at her chest. Kill her! Rylan roared, his voice cracking with the strain of a faltering alpha command. Tear her to pieces! Behind him, the front line of Silvercrest enforcers tensed. Muscles coiled, claws extended, and a low, collective growl began to build in their chests. They had been conditioned for 5 years to obey Rylan without question. Habit drove them forward, but biology stopped them cold. As the first enforcer, a massive, scarred brute, lunged forward, Alora didn't flinch. She simply widened her stance and let the full, unadulterated weight of her true alpha aura detonate. It wasn't a sound. It was a shockwave. The pressure hit the Silvercrest army like a physical wall of iron. The rushing enforcer gasped, his momentum instantly crushed as his knees buckled. He slammed into the steel grating of the bridge, his chin hitting the metal with a sickening clang. Beside him, dozens of others collapsed, clutching their chests as the air was forcibly driven from their lungs. A true alpha did not need to demand submission. A true alpha's very existence commanded it. Get up! Rylan screamed, striking the nearest kneeling wolf with his cane. Stand up and fight, you cowards! But they couldn't. The genetic imperative overriding their nervous systems was absolute. The wolves of the Crimson Creek and Ironjaw packs, brought in as allies, immediately averted their eyes and bared their necks, recognizing a supreme ruler. Seeing his army instantly pacified by a single woman he had kept collared in a basement, Rylan lost the last shred of his sanity. With a guttural roar, he threw aside his cane. His bones snapped and reformed in a blur of violent motion. In his place stood a massive, heavily scarred gray wolf, its eyes wild with homicidal desperation. He lunged at Alora, aiming to tear out her throat before she could fully realize her power. Alora did not shift. She didn't need to. Her senses, hyper-tuned and flowing with ancestral strength, tracked his movement in agonizing slow motion. As the gray wolf's jaws snapped toward her neck, Alora stepped smoothly to the side. She reached out, her hand moving like lightning, and seized the thick ruff of fur at the back of Rylan's neck. Using his own massive momentum against him, she pivoted and slammed his head down into the steel bridge with earth-shattering force. The metal groaned under the impact. The gray wolf let out a strangled yelp, his legs scrabbling frantically against the wet grating. Alora didn't let go. She pressed her knee into his spine, pinning the usurper alpha to the ground, with a strength that defied her human form. Her silver eyes blazed like twin stars in the darkness, and when she spoke, her voice echoed in the minds of every single wolf present. Submit. The command was absolute. It carried the weight of her father's murder, the agony of her 5 stolen years, and the undeniable right of her bloodline. Beneath her, The gray wolf whined, the fight completely drained out of Rylan. He shuddered, his body forcibly reverting to human form under the crushing weight of her dominance. He lay on the wet steel, gasping for air, utterly defeated. Alora stepped back, looking out over the sea of bowed heads. 300 wolves kneeled before her in the freezing rain. To her right, Vance was dragging himself backward by his elbows, weeping openly, his shattered leg trailing uselessly behind him. Alora looked at him for a long, quiet moment. 5 years ago, she would have wanted him dead. Now, looking at the pathetic, sniveling creature in the mud, she realized he wasn't worth the stain on her hands. "Take them to the cells," Alora commanded, her voice ringing clear over the wind. She gestured to Rylan and Vance. "They will face the High Council for treason, embezzlement, and the unlawful suppression of a pack heir." Immediately, 4 Silvercrest enforcers, men who had ignored her screams just days ago, leapt up, grabbing Rylan and Vance with rough, unforgiving hands, eager to prove their loyalty to their true alpha. The fog at the Obsidian end of the bridge parted. Kalen walked out of the mist. He wasn't accompanied by an army, though Alora could feel the terrifying presence of his 50 Obsidian elite waiting silently in the shadows. He walked alone, his dark eyes fixed entirely on her. He didn't bow. He didn't submit. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, his towering frame providing a sudden, warm shield against the biting wind. He looked down at her, taking in her glowing silver eyes, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, and the absolute command she had just effortlessly wielded. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across Kalen's face. It was a smile of profound pride and deep, possessive reverence. He reached out, his large, warm hand finding hers in the freezing rain. He intertwined their fingers, lifting her hand to his lips to press a tender kiss against her knuckles. "Your throne awaits, Queen of Silvercrest," Kalen murmured, his voice a dark velvet rumble meant only for her. Alora looked up at him, the silver in her eyes softening into a warm, radiant glow. For 5 years, she had been a ghost, haunting her own life. But as she stood on the bridge, her hand held firmly by the most dangerous alpha on the continent, looking out at the pack that was finally hers to heal, Alora took her first true breath. The Omega was dead. The true alpha had risen, and the shadows would never touch her again. Alora's journey from a collared, broken Omega to the rightful true alpha of the Silvercrest pack is a testament to the unbreakable nature of the spirit. No matter how deep the shadows or how heavy the chains, true power, born of endurance, truth, and love, will always find a way to rise and roar. With the Obsidian Alpha by her side, a new, formidable era has dawned for the werewolf territories. If you loved this story of resilience, pack politics, and slow-burn werewolf romance, please like this video, share it with your fellow fiction lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a wild new story. Until next time, stay fierce.